Thank you all so much for joining us here today. It's really great to see such a great audience. My name is it's Professor Nella Banks. And I have the honour of being the Director of Social Responsibility with the School of Environment, Education and Development. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today for our second SEED Annual Social Responsibility Lecture. These are really important events for us. They're not only an opportunity to learn about positive social, economic and environmental change, they're also an opportunity for us all to learn about what we can do, both individually and collectively, to support, build, catalyse and accelerate these positive changes. We want each and every one of us here today to leave thinking about our role as change makers and with some ideas of what we can do to realise that. Change starts with us in the smallest of ways in our daily decisions. Change builds and is amplified when we all come together along similar commitments and actions that build collectively towards a better future. At the times we find ourselves in, we need to be aware of and remember the power that we have to stand up, take action, come together and to keep fighting around the issues that we believe in. We're really excited to work with SEED students this year to build a student social responsibility team to embrace and support student change makers. I'd warmly encourage all SEED students here today to join us at a World Cafe event next week, where we'll be discussing what this looks like and how we can go about building it together. And we'll leave you with a slide at the end of the event. But returning to today's exciting events, let me pass you over to two of our brilliant SEED changemakers from the Global Development Institute, who are going to chair the event today. I will introduce Eren Bozacigurbuz. I think I've done a terrible job. I did practice, I'm sorry. And Wolff, who are two of our second-year undergraduates in the Global Development Institute. They're going to introduce our guests and jump in as we celebrate the Fairtrade movement, one of the most important and successful campaigns and movements in history that has improved countless lives and livelihoods. So let's get out there, let's inspire, and let's continue to work together to continue supporting positive change and fairer todays and futures. Over to you, Eren. Over to you, George.
Suitable. Thank you very much, Nikki. Thanks very much, Nikki, for those kind words of introduction, and was not a butchering of the surname, so thank you very much as well for that. I think we've got a video that we're going to play now, which really encompasses what Fairtrade stands for and what it means to be a part of Fairtrade. And let's watch this one before we move on to our great panelists that I have here today. I think we can all agree it's a very powerful video, and we have four esteemed guests here with us today that will be discussing more about the world of Fairtrade. And I think let's swiftly move on for them to introduce themselves, starting with Stephanie on the left here.
I'm Stephanie Barrientos. I'm an Emeritus Professor in the Global Development Institute. It's a great privilege to be here. I've taught at Manchester for nearly 15 years. And also it's really great to have this event here because the University of Manchester is a Fairtrade university. So a lot of the products you buy will be Fairtrade labelled, and also the Co-op is the nearest supermarket, and that is also very strong Fairtrade support.
Mike. Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Gidney. I'm the Chief Executive of the Fairtrade Foundation, the charity behind the Fairtrade mark that you will see on products, and it is lovely to be here with you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Emily Pearce. I'm Senior Sustainable Sourcing and International Development Manager at the Co-op. It's a ridiculously long job title, but amongst my responsibilities, I have the privilege of leading the Co-op's Fairtrade strategy. I'm Joanna Abena Fianu. I'm the chair of Fairtrade Lancashire. I'm the manager of the Fairtrade shop in Bolton, which is called Justicia. And I also work with BAS Fairtrade Network UK, which is the network body for all the independent Fairtrade shops and suppliers in the UK.
Thank you very much, panelists, for introducing yourselves. Now it's time for some questions. So this question is particularly directed at Mike and other panelists, should you wish to contribute. I'm sure there'll be some members of the audience that won't be aptly aware of Fairtrade. So Mike, what is Fairtrade and why is it important to you?
Oh, well, Fairtrade is basically a set of principles. It's a belief that trade, if you do it right, really can work for people and planet. And the Fairtrade movement has been going for decades, even longer than the 30 years that this Fairtrade mark has been going. And it began as a response to the fact that trade really wasn't working as it should. As globalization was progressing, what we were seeing was companies getting bigger, supply chains globally getting longer, people getting poorer, and the planet getting dirtier. So to tackle increasing exploitation in supply chains and human rights abuses, and to tackle a growing concern about the climate crisis and pollution and environmental degradation, Fairtrade was convened around this. So the Fairtrade Foundation, where I work, really formalizes a set of minimum environmental and social standards on the basis that if you comply with these standards, you can have the Fairtrade mark and you're certified and checked. But it means that you are part of the solution. It means that your company, your product, is traded in a way which respects human rights and environmental justice. I mean, you would think it's basic, right? You would think that was the basic norm that all of us would expect to be in the world. And it's a corrective response to the kind of, I would say, exploitative and rather rapacious globalization since the Second World War. So it's a set of standards, but actually much more than that. It's also a movement of people. You know, it really is. It's driven by the public. And you can trace that right back to the abolitionists, you know, those people in the 18th century who were first campaigning against enslaved people being involved in global production. I mean, there is an absolute sort of intergenerational link to this. And it starts with consumers caring. And that is what has driven Fairtrade to be what it is today. And now we work with 2 million farmers and workers in 75 countries across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, with most of the high street companies that you would think of. And we are really pushing the boundaries of social and environmental justice. But it starts with people. It starts with people caring.
If any of the other panelists want to touch on?
I think just from the standpoint of the global development, I think, I mean, we do so much work and research and teaching on poverty in lower income countries. And I think just in terms of certainly my own research and a lot of what is taught, that so many people who are in poverty are actually producing or engaged in production of goods for markets, traditionally for markets in Europe and North America. And I think just, and yet, even though they produce high value goods, so often suffer the kind of poverty they're talking about. So I think for me, really important is promoting and getting more justice for those producers and workers who feed into the value chains of the goods that we buy here. So I think Fairtrade has a really, really important role to play.
I would just add in from a business perspective that Fairtrade is a certification. It has very strong, independently set standards and mechanisms to ensure that there is a fairer price going back to the producers at the bottom of supply chains. And it is also a democratic system where producers own part of the Fairtrade system, and that is, it is unique. It is the only certification for ethics and sustainability that really operates in that way, trying to kind of bake fairness into how it's run, but also to have that safety net through Fairtrade minimum price. So if a global market crash happens and let's say for coffee, which happens fairly frequently, the global price falls below a sustainable minimum, those coffee farmers who are sourcing in Fairtrade terms and producing in Fairtrade terms are protected in that global system. So it's putting in place checks and balances that ensure that producers are treated more fairly, have more power in the system, and also fairer income and wages. And in addition, they get a Fairtrade premium, which is really, really important. That's an extra sum of money that goes back to their own cooperative or their own kind of premium committee, and is decided on by them for them to use in their own communities on what their needs are. So whether that's environmental projects, whether that's social projects like education, healthcare, good agricultural practice. So it's really development through trade, which has a wider impact into the communities that we source from. And, from being out there visiting producer communities, producers themselves said that this is the certification that works best for them, delivers the biggest benefit into their community, which is really important to say.
And what I would add to that is, so the World Fair Trade Organization definition of fair trade, 2 words rather than 1 word, they're slightly different, but the movement is the same. It starts with fair trade is partnership. And that is really different from anything else that you will see in global trade, because normal trade, conventional trade, is not about partnership. It's not about dialogue. It's about who's got the power. I've got the power. I'm going to make you pay to take a pay cut. And so actually fair trade being that partnership, having, as Emily was saying, the fact that ownership of fair trade belongs to the 2 million farmers and workers and their representatives on the board of fair trade. It's a premium that goes back to the community, and they get to decide how that money is spent. So it's part of a movement that is about radical concepts like decolonisation, like reparations. These come into fair trade because we are honouring the skills of the people that grow and make the things that we want to buy in this country, and just honouring that experience and skills and giving them back the power and changing the dynamic. It's all about changing the way we do business.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for those answers so far. I think now that we've covered what fair trade really is, I think if we could dive in, perhaps starting with Emily, if you could touch maybe more on how the ownership of fair trade belonging to the farmers. If you could discuss some of the greatest successes that fair trade have experienced, starting with Emily, and then again, any of the other panelists that want to step in as well.
Sure. Well, I think Mike's already touched on it. We've already touched on it slightly. I mean, this started from a really radical concept of looking, at global supply chains and how could we change this for the better. And I was speaking with Cafe Direct recently, and they're one of the first brands to have the Fairtrade mark on their pack, and Co-op applied from them since 1992, and they were one of the first to get the mark in 1994. That started with 0.5 ton of coffee beans in trust around do something with these coffee beans, try and improve our lives in some way. And they're now a major business, really successfully trading. They're a social enterprise that have brought out a commercial business. And as Mike said, we've now got 2 million farmers and workers around the world who are benefiting from fair trade that are certified in the movement. That's massive, and something that the fair trade system should be really, really proud of. And from our perspective as the co-op, we're really, really proud to have pioneered fair trade since the very beginning. And again, back 30 years ago, you could only get fair trade products often in church halls or in specialist shops. It wasn't a mainstream product that you could get anywhere. But thanks to the commitment of people who believed in the concept of fair trade, who supported mainstreaming it, which I do think Co-op played a really fundamental role in doing, you can now, as a customer, go into most shops and get a fair trade product. There's 5,000 licensed products in the UK, I think, and 1.7 billion was raised for fair trade premium, I think in the last 20 years. So it's a really, really massive achievement that in a really, busy, difficult, competitive world, that this movement for change has existed and has managed to really change the way people shop. And as Mike said, customers have been absolutely instrumental in this. It is a demand-driven scheme. If you don't ask for it, and you don't purchase it and you're not loyal to it, those producers are not getting the benefit. And that also means that the companies that champion it, that we have to be committed to that cause. So it is a real partnership. And for us as a consumer co-op, it really chimed with our principles and values, because you're not aware of the co-op. I'll give a little history lesson. We were founded 180 years ago by a bunch of pioneers called the Rochdale Pioneers to address some of the trade issues of the day, the food system issues of the day. And it really chimes with our principles as a co-op, because of democracy, because of fairness, because of responsibility. And because of that, our member owners have been instrumental in saying this is something that the co-op should support and we should stand behind. And we really believe that co-op has been instrumental in mainstreaming fair trade into UK retail. So from being amongst the first to support putting it into our shops 30 years ago, to making sure that all of our shops sold fair trade products in 1998, to bringing the first UK fair trade bananas to UK stores in 2000, to just a few weeks ago, we committed that 100% of the roses sold in our stores would be fair trade. But that's taken commitment, not just, obviously, I wasn't working there 30 years ago, I'm not looking this good. I thought, need a magician. But it's been people who have understood the concept, who work in businesses, in campaign movements, in consumers, who have stood together and have said, this is the right thing to do, and we will continue to champion that movement. And that's what's really, really unique about it, and something that I think is one of the true successes, is it brings together competitors even to say, this is something we all should be supporting. And we're really, really proud of the impact that we have. Through our sourcing, we now benefit the lives of almost 500,000 farmers and workers across the world. And that's something that we feel really proud that we are able to do.
Perhaps Mike, if you would comment on this as well, the largest successes.
I mean, Emily's absolutely right about the co-op. They've played an absolute leadership role with this. If I was thinking about like the successes, maybe it's breaking it into kind of micro and a meso and a macro example. Right? The micro example, fair trade works. Right? The idea that if you pay farmers a fair price, and you share negotiating power with them in the way that Joanna was talking about around a partnership, things happen, right? So they are able to look after themselves, their communities, their farms. And in an increasingly challenging world against the climate crisis, that's in our interests, right? So the UK as a whole imports 40% of our food and drink. About 12 to 15% of that comes from low-income countries, many of whom are under high stress and high risk related to the climate crisis. So if we want to carry on enjoying bananas and coffee and cocoa and tea in the future, it matters to us that farmers are able to take care of themselves, take care of their farms. And there's so much evidence, there's more than 700 academic studies, some of which test them, on the impact of fair trade. So at a micro level, it really works, and there's loads of proof. At a kind of meso level also, one of the things that keeps these long-term supply chains exploitative is an imbalance in power. In most of trade, it's a buyer's market. The buyer dictates, and then the suppliers have just got to jump. What price, what terms? Fair trade negotiates a different set of relationships. And so there is an opportunity for farmers to come together in groups, many of whom are in cooperative structures, so democratically accountable groups, where they are able to flex more power in their own negotiations and have more control over their own futures, their farming as well as their community futures. That is incredibly important from a human development point of view and a social justice point of view. And then at a kind of macro level, and I wouldn't underestimate this at all, this is a source of hope, right? So I mean, I'm sure it's really possible for all of us to get completely despondent reading the newspapers, particularly at the moment where the world feels so incredibly insecure, not just because of the climate crisis, but because of the endless geopolitical challenges that we can all identify. There is an opportunity to do things differently, which really, really does work. And at a sort of minimum, kind of really simplistic theory of change level, we want to see a better impact environmentally and socially for farming communities around the world. To do that, you need companies to pay attention to environmental and social standards, minimum standards, codified and fair. To do that, you need the public to show they care. And there is an opportunity and an agency for us as consumers to be part of that change. And that works right the way through these supply chains. And it really does work. So at the macro level, it's, for me, a source of constant hope for a better future.
Could I add another micro example, actually, because I meant to mention this before. Mike and I went to Ghana last year, which was amazing. Nothing beats going and seeing the change. But I mentioned before that we were Co-op Worthy, first company to bring Fairtrade bananas to UK shelves back in 2000. Well, the cooperative that partnered with us, who are called Pharrell, are still in our supply chains today. And we went to visit Pharrell in Ghana, and we heard from their premium committee, because I think it's really important to actually, we talk about the benefits, but actually to hammer it home is hearing, again, directly from producers themselves. And their premium committee talked to us about the difference that it's had, about the fact that 30 years ago, the children of the banana workers in those communities, they didn't have schoolrooms. They were learning under trees. So if it rained, tough. You know, school was out or you had to get wet. Now, because of the Fairtrade Premium, which has been dedicated in the main to education for the children of banana workers, they have now built schoolrooms and school blocks for many communities. They have scholarships, which means that children can go on to higher education or further education. And they said to us, you know, Fairtrade, you know, has made a fundamental difference to their lives. And they were so proud to say that banana workers' children, they are now doctors, they're now teachers, they're now engineers. And one of their children was even doing a master's in agriculture in Italy. This was unheard of for this community and is a real tangible example of the difference that the dignity that Fairtrade gives and the funding it gives is actually leading to that hope in those sorts of communities.
Well, it's amazing to hear the spillover benefits of Fairtrade within those Ghanaian communities. So now it's time for a slightly more challenging question, starting with Steph. Steph, what are the opportunities and challenges associated with Fairtrade?
Yes, now I think Mike referred to the fact that we live in very challenging times. So just thinking of, and these challenges affect everyone, including Fairtrade. So just thinking through some of the challenges, I think one of the obvious ones that could have affected Fairtrade is just the cost of living crisis, the pandemic, and then the cost of living crisis. People just, consumers have less money in their pockets to buy fair trading goods, not to buy any goods, including Fairtrade. And then also, of course, the cost of living crisis affects producers equally, because that increases all the cost of their inputs, etc. So this has fed right the way through the supply chain. But I think two things on that. Firstly, it's really interesting that despite the crisis, Fairtrade sales have held up. And I think it's about 70% of all adults in the UK in the past year bought fair traded goods. So that's despite the crisis. But also I think an opportunity here is that the younger generation especially are increasingly aware of where goods come from and the importance of addressing social inequality, poverty, climate change and other challenges. So that's the future generation of consumers. And then equally with who will hopefully continue buying and buy more fairly traded goods, and equally for producers, that they're in producer groups. And that's a really important part of fair trade, is that the co-ops or the small producer organisations, especially for the smaller ones who are more marginalised and more fragmented, is that coordination gives them a greater power in the supply chain than they would have if they were just fragmented, and then the ability to make the decisions that they do. I think another big challenge that facing fair trade, facing everybody, and I guess especially in this geopolitical turbulence, is the way trade's shifting. So traditionally, trade was the majority of goods produced in low-income countries were exported to the global north, to Europe and North America. But since around 2019, 50% of goods produced in the global south are exported to other countries within the global south. So the whole dynamic of trade is beginning to shift, and you're getting a growth in consumer markets within Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, some people say, oh, that means things like standards will be ignored. In fact, the research we've done at Manchester, included, shows that no, that even in those markets, there is a growing interest in consumer who are interested in ensuring of buying goods that are fairly traded. I'll put that in a broad sense. But also for fair trade, that's an opportunity, because fair trade international is made up both of the licensees, the North American, European end, but also half of the governance are the 3 producer networks, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And they make up 50% of the decision-making power within fair trade internationally. But also, of course, they are based in those regions. They know the producers, they understand the issues they face, and they know those markets. And for all of them, growing fair trade within Africa, Asia, and Latin America is important. And then just finally, very, very briefly, I'll touch on it. There are big shifts going on in the sort of regulatory environment. Fair trade is a voluntary approach. It's, you volunteer to adopt fair trade in the way that the co-op did. But there are actually big shifts going on in the regulatory environment in the European Union, and which will affect the UK as well. And in approximately 6 years' time, you're going to have much greater regulation by the EU of corporate sustainability across the supply chain. So all the big corporations operating in Europe will have a legal responsibility to undertake due diligence in relation to human rights and environment within their supply chains. Now, again, there are big challenges for fair trade. There are worries that will marginalise small producers. But I think fair trade brings an opportunity because it organises small producers. Fair trade also, internationally, the headquarters are in Bonn. They have fair trade advocacy offices in Brussels, can influence how that process takes place. So can influence the decision-making process in terms of how that regulation plays out. But also, I think very importantly, because fair trade goes right way through the supply chain at all levels and brings in the small producers, can help to defend and support small producers in that process. So big challenges, but I personally think that fair trade is also really well positioned to take advantage, not benefits, wrong word, but to continue to make improvements in that complex and challenging environment.
Fantastic. Would anyone else like to comment?
There are so many challenges. So many challenges for all of us. I mean, like, where do I start? One of them is the risk that people stop caring. So again, so much of the newspapers, which thing are you going to get worried about first? Or are you just going to get so demotivated and despondent you turn off completely? That would be a real problem. So how do we keep trade and social and environmental justice through trade in the minds of consumers, where we'll all be blasted so much with messaging all the time? That's one challenge. Another challenge, and it's a sort of longer term one, but it is tough, is as the climate crisis will affect global trade flows, and indeed it will, does that mean that we should be stopping importing sugar? Sugar is a toxin, right? It's not a good thing to be consuming. Should we be bringing in cane sugar from the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries? Let's give you one example of this challenge there. Some years ago, when we were still in the EU changed the law around, or regulations around, how much beet sugar could be brought into the open market alongside cane sugar. At one swoop, that meant that cane sugar was suddenly much, much more expensive. So the brands were switching to cane sugar, domestically subsidized cane sugar, I might add, from Poland or France or the UK. And it meant that cane sugar was suddenly really like a third down, and then 2/3 after 5 years. And what that meant, of course, was the smallholder farmers who grow and cut the cane in Belize, in Fiji, in former colonies, I might add, of the European powers, had absolutely nothing. And of course, they were the last to be told. They didn't know this was going to happen. They had absolutely no time to adjust. So one of the conversations that goes on within sort of trade policy making is around adjustment costs. So when you open up a new free trade agreement between one trading bloc and another, there will be losers in sort of theory terms, and there is an in inverted commas an adjustment cost to be made. Now, what that never does is translate into human reality, right? So adjustment costs can't be quantified. If I went to Jamaica at the time that the sugar farmers were losing their market access, and the farming groups were so upset that yet again they had been ignored by the Europeans. And they were very clear. They said, we're only growing sugar because you people made us do it. And of course, sugar is the original crop of enslaved people from the Caribbean. So there is a long and very dirty history here that we cannot ignore. So even as trade is reforming and shaping and reshaping, we have to remember the reality of the lived experience of the people who are engaged in these supply chains and how we support them to live decent lives in the future. That's really complex, massive set of challenges, very often.
Yeah, so for me, one of the biggest opportunities that's still to be tapped into, I'm going to talk from my personal experience. I work with Ghanaian cocoa farmers, and most cocoa farmers have never tasted chocolate. Most of their children have never tasted chocolate. They don't know that what they're growing turns into chocolate. So the project that we're doing is to teach them how to make chocolate for local sale, and opportunities like that where people have been doing this since 150 years. They've been just growing the crop, bagging it up, sending it to Europe for processing. And that's actually two things. It's very bad for the environment because once immediately it arrives in the UK, about 20% of it is taken off in the winnowing process. So it makes a lot more sense for them to start doing some of the processing in country. But it also means that there are better jobs, that there is more of the future in cocoa. The average cocoa farmer is about 50 because young people, the wonderful success of all of the schools that have been built through Fairtrade has meant that the children of cocoa farmers don't have to become cocoa farmers, and it's not well enough paid for them to do so they don't. But if there are better jobs in cocoa processing, if there are better jobs in coffee processing, so I've been to the roastery where the Cafe Direct beans arrive in sacks and are then roasted and ground. That's the sort of thing that can be done in country. But the big challenge that we have is tariffs, because it's much, much more expensive to bring a bag of processed whatever compared to a bag of unprocessed crop. But actually, it makes much more sense to people in those countries to be able to do those things themselves, because then they will understand their own supply chain much better. And it's a much better story if you can have all of that produced in country and arrive in the UK. The other challenge, which is also an opportunity, Fairtrade was the first real recognised consumer mark. And a lot of people were sceptical when it first came in 30 years ago because they assumed that nobody cared. They assumed that why would you not just buy a thing based on price? Why would anybody care about the ethics of product? So now there's a plethora of different marks. So there's B Corp, there's Rainforest Alliance, there's Cocoa Life, there's this, that and the other. And the challenge we have is helping people understand why fair trade is better than all of those things. But that's also an opportunity because it's an education opportunity. So we can talk about the fair trade premium, which doesn't exist in any of those product certification marks, and the minimum price, which doesn't exist in any of those marks. And just to be able to say fair trade is different, it is so much better. The other big opportunity is that the vast majority of crops that are grown on fair trade terms are not sold on fair trade terms. So we don't need huge numbers of new farmers to be able to increase the market for fair trade. So what's happening is that the cocoa farmers, for example, and tea in particular is really bad. It's like 5% of the tea that is grown expensively on fair trade terms is sold on fair trade terms. So there's companies that are going in and buying fair trade tea but not paying for it. They're not paying the premium, they're not paying the minimum price, but they're taking advantage of the tea farmers who have gone through that certification process and have paid to go through that certification process. But because they have to sell their tea, they have to sell it quickly. So please buy more fair trade tea because it's so important for those farmers that they get the thing that they have put themselves through the certification process for.
I'd add on to that because I do think it's that's a really, really important issue. And you go to producer communities and it's a lot of effort to meet the fair trade standards, and for that effort not to be met with 100% fair trade sales is really, really challenging. So part of our job as a retailer or campaign group is, again, to remind people about the difference that it makes. And it is a huge difference that it makes, but it only makes that difference if the whole system is committed to those long-term relationships and to invest in fair trade. And it's because it makes a difference. And I'll touch on, I think, the biggest challenge, because we have touched on climate change, but I think it's worth hammering home how I think fair trade is really fundamental to that. This is the biggest challenge we face as a global society, and I'm sure, like me, you probably look at the news and feel pretty anxious and daunted by the challenges we face. By 2030, we face a 40% shortfall in fresh water. That's with current projections. That's probably going to get worse. 70% of water is used for agriculture. That's for the food and drink that we produce. And we are at the precipice of environmental collapse, nature collapse, biodiversity collapse, and devastating change in global climatic events, which are affecting supply chains now. So, I was out in Malawi 2 years ago. They're being hit by cyclones repeatedly, so often that they can't recover. And I met with Fairtrade sugar farmers, tea farmers who have had their crops, their houses, their livestock literally swept away. These are the scenarios that are happening within global supply chains, and they are going to get worse. Malawi, in that instance, they're only 0.04% of global emissions, yet they're in one of the top 10 countries being impacted by climate change. This is disrupting an equilibrium that we've had in global supply chains for a really, really long time. This is really scary stuff, and it's something that keeps me up at night. The answer is around how do we farm better? How do we use our resources better? How do we ensure that we are not wasting food? Because unfortunately, a huge amount of food that's produced is just wasted. It's about how do we farm more in line with nature and without highly hazardous pesticides. It's about how we use water responsibly. But these challenges massively exist right now. And 703 million people right now lack access to safe, clean drinking water. Right now. And some of those are fair trade farmers, because this is unfortunately the reality. So we need to grapple with that as a food system and try and find ways that we can make our world more fair, more equal, more redistributive, that we are not exploiting people and planet. And fair trade is a system to do that. Fair trade, and we touched on the fair trade producer networks, they have a role to play in supporting producer communities in upholding the standards, but then also doing work to deal with some of those really challenging issues that they face in those communities. And on top of that, companies like Co-op and others are investing in programs on top to help farmers and equip them for the challenges that they face. Because when I've been out there and met with farmers, they don't know why the rates haven't come necessarily. We've just finished a 3-year program with Fairtrade called FACSCA, which has been supporting producers to adapt and mitigate against climate change. These are we need to be investing in farmers now to be supporting that change. We need to be farming better now, and we need customers to understand that every time you purchase that Fairtrade product, or if your favourite brand or retailer doesn't, tell them to, because they do listen. That's a radical act. You're standing in solidarity with Fairtrade farmers. It's saying that you care about climate change. It's that you care about a more equal and redistributive world. So remembering that actually we all have a part to play in achieving that future that we really desperately need. And I think one of the things I take away from this is, unless we have more prosperity in our global supply chains with the people, but farmers feel that they have more dignity, that they want to stay in farming, that it's seen as a really important part of our world, we value our food properly, we're not going to achieve any of those changes.
Thank you. A lot of strong challenges raised there. I think all pointing us to show us how important fair trade is and how important buying fair trade is. I think now it's time to discuss how people, of course, a lot of young people in the audience today, how can people, specifically young people, uni students, get more involved within the world of fair trade and really be a part of it, perhaps beyond just buying your fair trade goods, fair trade wine, chocolate, etc. Perhaps on Joanna?
Yes, so it's up to all of us. Emily's already touched it on this a little bit. It's up to all of us. We have power. Sometimes we feel like we don't have power. We have power. We make little decisions every day, thousands of them. What time to get up, what time to... all of these little decisions. And every time you walk into a shop, you're making a decision. You're choosing to buy a fair trade product or not. Everything you buy pays someone's wages. Every time you buy something, you are casting a vote for the world that you want to see. So whenever you walk into a shop, there's a wonderful... The most important word in customer service is disappointed. So if you walk into a shop and you don't find the fair trade products that you're looking for, contact the customer service people and tell them who were disappointed. Because it works. I've never been disappointed with Co-op. But it's really important, and they care about what you think. The reason that the fair trade mark that was on 3 or 4 products 30 years ago is now on 3,000 or 4,000 products now is because we kept buying them. We told them by buying that we want these products to continue to be available. So as citizens, the most important thing that we can all do is just choose fair trade. If you want to go beyond that, fair trade is a grassroots movement. There are something like just over 2,000 fair trade towns all over the world. And with Fairtrade Lancashire, we're very proud that it started with us. So the first fair trade town in the world was Garstang, which is just north of Preston. And my friend Bruce Crowther and various other people decided in 2001 that they were going to try and make Garstang a fair trade town. They didn't really know what that looked like, but they knew that it was a important thing to do. So they started to think about what that might look like. And it's now grown into a global movement with cities like Seoul, LA, tiny little villages like Cherry Burton in Yorkshire are all fair trade communities. And that's a really important thing. And that grassroots community campaigning is the reason that fair trade has lasted as long as it has, and is as important as it is. Because there's no such thing as a rainforest alliance town. That doesn't exist. So it's that fair trade, that the importance of fair trade that exists within, and each of those fair trade communities has a group. So there's lots of different ones in Greater Manchester. There is actually a Greater Manchester fair trade group that's started up again recently. You can get involved in lots of different ways. Go and volunteer. So you can volunteer. There's fair trade shops in Bolton and Rochdale and Warrington and all sorts of different places. They're always looking for volunteers. So if you've got a few hours in your week, go and volunteer there. Find out a bit more about fair trade and get engaged with the issues around it. Find out about all the different products that are made and grown as fair trade. And just, when I started my business in 2005, I fell down a rabbit hole and I have never come out of it. So 20 years later, I'm still learning things about fair trade. It's absolutely fascinating. So if you've got that passion to find out about fair trade, really do. What we can do going forward, I did a talk with some primary school children a few weeks ago. They were about 10, and they said to me, no idea you could have a job in fair trade. And really excited of the idea that you could look for a career in fair trade. You can start a social enterprise that works with some of the people that you meet in your community. You can support fair trade in lots and lots of different ways, from starting by buying and ending by selling. Basically, that's the process. So there's lots of different ways that you can get involved, either in a community. Follow the Fairtrade Foundation on social media, because there's lots of different campaigns that come about. That's one of the easiest things you can do, just retweeting or sharing some of their posts. There's a campaign at the moment where we're asking people to contact their MPs. So if you would contact your MP, ask them to sign a pledge in support of fair trade. I suspect one of the people who's leading this is the new MP for Glasgow North, who used to be the CEO of the Scottish Fair Trade Forum. So all of the first 4 people that signed that were all the Glasgow MPs, which I'm sure he forced them all to do. So being a good citizen is also being a fair citizen, is also being a fair trade citizen. So just get involved any way that you can and just tell people about fair trade. If you're picking an item off the shelf and you're with a friend and they go, well, why don't you buy that one? It's cheaper. Explain why. Just telling people those stories about actually, this is important to me and this is why. And if you can just convert one person and they can convert one person, then you get further and further and the movement grows. And that's how we got where we are today with over 2,000 fair trade towns around the world.
Can I just add to that also? There are also, I can't remember exactly how many now, but there are also a number of fair trade universities. And the University of Manchester is one of those universities and has won awards as well as a result. And it's partly top down. The University of Manchester has 3 pillars, research, teaching and social responsibility. And obviously fair trade fits as part of that whole social responsibility agenda. And that's why, in part, why we're having this session today. But it was also partly bottom up because large numbers of students, especially in previous years, were emailing and asking the university, why aren't you selling fair trade? Why isn't there more fair trade products available? So the university committed to becoming a fair trade university, which it is, which means that a large range of the products and a lot of the sourcing of goods that you buy in the university, where possible, come through from fair trade suppliers. And so I think very important is that keep the pressure, keep emailing and saying, we know climate crisis is important, but also supporting farmers is important and workers. So keep that kind of pressure coming. And also very important is to buy the products and in the university, because I know it costs more sometimes, not always, but sometimes to source fair trade products than non-fair. You can always get cheap goods, but those cheap goods, goodness knows how they've been produced or how and what farmers got paid and what the workers got paid. So just keeping that pressure on from the bottom, and then that helps keeping the whole kind of social responsibility momentum going.
I could add a couple of other things. So one of the things, well, obviously I'm going to say shop at the co-op. So
Very far away.
At least not very far away. But 100% of the coffee, the cocoa, the bananas, the tea, the bagged sugar, the roses, and South African wine is fair trade. We also have a lot of other fair trade products. It's our ambition is to make it easy for our customers and our members to choose fair trade, and that's really, really important. So we make it easy for you. So if you buy anything, including those goods, you can get fair trade products. We have a lot of accessible pricing. So it's not always more expensive to buy fair trade. Actually, all of our entry-level wine, which is often interested by students, but that's all fair trade. So it's not necessary that fair trade is always more expensive. It's about where some of that value goes. So if your favourite brand doesn't support fair trade, ask them. Use your voice. Just to add on to what you said earlier, if you email the co-op about fair trade, I get your email. So it does actually end up with the people, and that's really important. So use your voice. In addition, if you're not a member of the co-op, you can become a member of the co-op, and our members are owners of our business, and you have a say in how we all run. And that's partly why fair trade has been so important, is because our member owners at consecutive AGMs have asked our co-op to champion, climate change, to champion ethical and sustainable issues and fair trade repeatedly, and that has helped keep our business really committed to fair trade. So using your voice is really, really important. But also, many of you at the start of what will be long careers, and you'll have roles in businesses or in NGOs or academia, and that has a lot of influence. And sometimes you could be in a business that doesn't support anything to do with this, and you can be that change. And that's so, so important to learn and get curious about these issues and to stand for something and to be principled. Fairtrade is a principle. And I think that's really, really important to think about when you get into that, that area of your life. What role can you play when you are there?
Oh, no, one more thing. I mean, all of these things are really, really good points. But also, channel your inner skeptic. Right? You guys are all really, you're highly educated, and there is something here for us to take a moment and just think about the marketing that we have all been subjected to as British consumers. Like, who the hell decided that chocolate should be Belgian? Right. We go back to Joanna's point about trying to add value with producers in country so they can get into processing. Tariffs and taxes around trade make that difficult. Why? Because it protects the Europeans. So why is chocolate Belgian or why is chocolate Swiss? There is something deeply ugly in that colonial history. Similarly, English breakfast tea. Right, so behind that, and we all think about our lovely cuppa and how much we all love it, sexual exploitation of women and girls in tea estates in Central and Eastern Africa and South Asia is absolutely rampant. Workers live on a pittance in tea production. And we think about English breakfast tea as a lovely part of being British. It's marketing comp. So as much as we are talking about how you can help really support the champions like the Co-op with really good reasons, also use your power, your intelligence and education and your agency to call out the laggards. If you're being given marketing puff, challenge. So if some company tells you about their wonderful sustainability credentials, ask them, how much are you paying the farmers? Fairtrade is the only scheme that guarantees a minimum price for farmers. And if they can't tell you, the answer is, well, that's not good enough, right? If they can't tell you how much they're paying the farmers, that's the first question. The second question is, and who is checking you to make sure that you're as good as your claims? If any of these schemes are not being independently guaranteed and verified by an independent third party, it's puff. People setting and marking their own homework. So challenge these guys, because maybe they're just a little bit misguided. Maybe they want to be part of the solution but don't know how. So a bit of a kicking from you and from others who are engaged really helps create that race to the top that we all really badly need.
Thank you very much for your insights. I think now it's time to open the discourse to the audience. So if you have any burning questions, please fire away.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So you can get Fairtrade cotton, and as you said, cosmetics as well. But we're most involved with food. We have for a number of years been working on artisanal small-scale mining. So if you think about sub-Saharan Africa, the second biggest employer after agriculture is the extractive industry. So if we can find a way of making it work in mining, then you start to bring the benefits of global trade to many more people. It's really tough. So we've just started with small-scale mining because they are the most, perhaps you might say, they're like the most disadvantaged, the most exploitive. It's people who are panning for gold in informal setups who have no protection, no health and safety apps. I mean, they're invisible. Sometimes they're also illegal, right? So people working illegally on other people's land. So it is a really exploitative part of the mining sector. And of course, it goes into jewelry. I think it's about 10% of British gold that goes into jewelry comes from artisanal small-scale mining. So there's a really powerful case for change. The complexity is the very, very long and very opaque supply chain. So it is really difficult to create the kinds of high-level guarantees that we would expect as part of fair trade right there through the value chain. You can do it at the first stage with the miners, but when they then sell it to the aggregator or the collector locally, who then sends it to the capital city, and they collect it and they mix it with other sources of gold, being able to guarantee to the consumer that you're across the whole supply chain is really complex. We're not giving up, but we're not there yet.
Can I comment that as well? Because the other thing, I've got a Fairphone, and it would be really nice if Fairphone had enough support from people who were able to then turn that into tablets, laptops, that kind of thing. But this sits at the intersection of fair trade and social enterprise, because the other thing you can do is buy refurbished. So that's instead of, it's old, get a new one. You can. There's lots and lots of places all over the place where you can send your laptop away, and they will refurbish it and sell it on. So you buy your upgraded one that somebody else has given, and that means that none of it gets wasted. There's a fantastic place called Recycle IT in Bolton. I was down there the other day, and there's just bits of everything everywhere. It looks great. And they know what everything, and I have no idea. But you just take them your old electronics, and they upgrade them and sell them on, and they give work to disadvantaged people in the UK. And they're trying to keep young lads out of sort of gangs and drugs and that kind of thing by giving them something interesting to do. So this is fair trade is not ever going to be the answer to everything, but things adjacent to fair trade will always be the answer to almost everything. So it's about thinking outside the box. It's not just a case of this is terrible, we can't do anything about it. There's always another way if you sort of start thinking laterally.
There are other schemes as well. So we work with Transform Trade, who are also a fair trade organisation. They formerly were Tradecraft. And through them, we have developed our own fairly traded products. So you can get fairly traded rubber gloves, fairly traded charcoal, and fairly traded coffee. We have a few business, we'll all leave on Monday. So there are other fair trade movements out there. Fairtrade International is the most prevalent, but there are other schemes out there. So I do your research. I think getting curious about this. Go on Ethical Consumer magazine. Start to research before you buy. Is there a better version? Fairphone's a great example. There are other kind of fair trade can't do everything. There's enough to do in certain areas already, but there will be other alternative schemes in particular markets. So do your research and get curious. That's my advice. I think, of course, there's more nuance to all of these issues, but many of the products that we're talking about with fair trade, you can't grow a banana in the UK. They're really nutritious. That's obviously, I love them personally, but they're a really nutritious, healthy product. They're really, really important livelihood for people in Colombia or Dominican Republic, Ghana. But of course, there's all sorts of nuances in that. Looking at air miles alone, though, is not the accurate read on the climate footprint of a product and the environmental footprint and the social footprint of a product. So Fairtrade actually have a really good study that you've just refreshed on roses, as an example, because one comes to mind. So, a lot of us enjoy flowers, and the perception would be that to get them from the Netherlands, which is closer, would be a lower carbon footprint and energy footprint than getting them from Kenya. But it's not true. It's, I think, about a third of the environmental footprint, even with the flying over from Kenya, due to the energy cost involved in glass houses. So looking at air miles alone never is the full story. It's about the land use change associated. It's about the ability to have alternatives in this country. So for the co-op, we have a strong British commitment. All of our meat is British. We support British sourcing in season, but we also have to source from overseas. Of course we do, and I think it's about 40% of all food comes from overseas, and that's always going to be a part of what we have to do to ensure that we have the choice for our customers. I think these are really, really important questions. I think we should be obviously moving to a mix and making the decisions that make the most benefit, mixing in all of these different issues, ensuring we don't cause too much unnecessary food waste and all these different things. But they're really, really important questions that you raise. And absolutely, when we look at, as I sit in a wider sustainability team, we make decisions looking across the whole spectrum of issues to try and ensure we make the right choices from a sustainability perspective, but taking into account the environment and people.
It's a really good point, and it plays a little bit to the last question as well. Globalization, unfettered and unthought through, has resulted in a number of problems that we are looking and discussing about how we redress them. So one of them would be local sourcing and what we import. Do we need to wean our kids off bananas and get them involved more in British fruit? A couple of problems with that. One is the You can't just ignore the hundreds of millions of people around the world who are growing things for the former colonial powers of Europe. And there will be enormous human and human rights as well as human livelihoods impacts if we just pull out. But in terms of trade, the way that's manifests in trade policy, you are right. There is a trend towards protectionism, recognizing that globalization, was too unfettered. So, I mean, surely the logic is a balance, right? So eventually, I mean, to give you a campaigning example, so Joanna was talking about the Fairtrade sort of campaigners around the country. Fairtrade campaigners in Cumbria have a slogan which is "Cumbria fair and local." And that's a consumer campaign, which is basically, if you can buy it locally, buy it locally. But if it's something that you can't grow locally, make sure it's fair trade. There is something there which actually, if you translated that campaigner narrative into trade policy, would start to reshape the way we look at tariffs, tariff escalation, non-tariff barriers. We should be able, at the same time, if we were going to reform that, to enable Ghanaians and Ivorian cocoa farmers to process in-country, capture more value at source, which means that they're not, dependent on the kind of development agenda that still, affects the North and the South. So I think you're absolutely right. There is something about rebalancing a global free market to localism. It's not an extreme thing. You balance it according to human rights and environmental standards.
Can I just add to that as well? I think it's important. I mean, trade policy comes in at two levels. One is the sort of regulation, the European Union and now the UK post-Brexit, what kind of tariffs and what kind of trade policy do we have? But also I think remembering, and again this is a lot of research at Manchester, is the whole way global value chains have evolved. So there's both what goes on at the sort of regulatory level, but there are also the very large multinational companies and retailers who themselves also have standards that they operate within their supply chain. So suppliers are actually facing two sets of regulatory barriers. And I think going back to that earlier point that Mike made is that there are really great power imbalances inside those global value chains. So the big multinationals have enormous power relative to the more fragmented and especially the smaller scale producers. And I think that's where organisations and Fairtrade in particular is well ahead in this game, is in a position to help to organise those smaller producers so that they have more of a voice in that process, but also to sit down and negotiate with those big retailers and big brands, which particularly the ones that sell. I don't know about the co-op and fair trade, but I can imagine sometimes there are some quite detailed conversations going on about products that are sold. But producers on their own can't do that. But Fairtrade is an organisation that represents producers that is in a position to do it. So I think it's looking at both dimensions of regulation.
So the freedom point, your last point, I think is the way into this. So from actually even before the Thatcher government, but pretty much since the Second World War, there's been an inverted commas consensus that free trade will solve the world's problems. So you have a very small state, very small regulation. Let the market decide. It'll float all boats, trickle down will work, and everyone will be happy. Of course, free trade works. It's free choice for the biggest and most powerful players. So an end goal of fair trade, well, I mean, there are a number, but one of them, I think, which for me is most important, is agency for the producers themselves. So the women and men at the first mile of these very big, complex global supply chains, for them to have agency. If they want to stop being a cocoa farmer and go and do a master's and become a lawyer, that's really cool, right? I mean, that's the end goal right there. It doesn't mean that there's going to be no cocoa farmers. People will always want to grow whatever, because it's the market. I mean, it's trade, not aid, right? So the market, if there is a gap suddenly and consumer demand that is not being met, somebody will come up with growing cocoa again. But the problem we've got is this colonial legacy. So I was talking about sugar, and when the EU sugar reforms happened, what was happening in Jamaica. The Jamaican sugar farmers at the time wanted to get involved in cocoa production. That's what they were hoping to be able to do, because Caribbean cocoa is very, very high quality, higher quality than West African cocoa, so they can access more markets. They had absolutely no working capital to be able to do that. because hundreds of years actually in that case, but certainly in other products, decades of long-term low pricing means there is no working capital for farmers to be able to diversify. And so we because being the beneficiaries of these long-term low pricing, we're actually maintaining that model of exploitation. If it's power and price, if you find a way of sharing more power with the first mile, produce the first mile, and better pricing, lo and behold, they become more self-determining. They decide what they want to do. And so that's how you break the colonial cycle. But it does need both of those things, fairer pricing and fairer share of power.
I just thought into that because I think it's a super interesting question that you posed, and I think the other thing we haven't really talked about here is actually Fairtrade through the work the producer networks does with the farmers is to do a lot of income diversification projects and loads of work on that to reduce the reliance on a single crop, because that does mean that there's a reliance there, and that is a weakness, sort of vulnerability that Fairtrade actually actively seeks to reduce. So there's a huge amount of work that they do with producer groups to help them to develop other streams of income into the local economy or into other Fairtrade supply chains. So we haven't really touched on that a lot today, but actually that's a huge area that Fairtrade does. And again, in some of the programs that we run on top, like that program I talked about FAXCA before, that was also about seed funding for small businesses, youth-led businesses, also working, we funded programs around more climate resilient varieties of coffee beans. So it's about like building resilience and freedom, I think is a really important word, into those communities. And we have had producers who've turned around and said to us, well, actually we can get a better price somewhere else. And fine, great, it's not, there is freedom in this, but equally we've also had situations where there has been an issue with supply. So we've had droughts, that's affecting the whole market. And actually, because we are committed to Fairtrade farmers have said, we want to supply you first because you've been there when times have been difficult. So I think that the market dynamics we have at the moment are just a highway to hell. And actually, we need systems like Fairtrade. It doesn't do anyone any good. In 2019, there was a global coffee price crash and 24 million coffee farmers were left destitute because they were not protected. I think we see that for a free market is not going to solve anything. We actually do need some checks and balances because that doesn't help customers, it doesn't help farmers, it doesn't help businesses. And actually, we need to be working as one system. So I think the goal is for Fairtrade not to have to exist. But until governments put in the right regulation, until there's right checks and balances, we're going to need systems like Fairtrade. And it is as relevant now as it was back in 1994. And I think with the increasing regulation that's coming through, you're going to see more businesses investing in Fairtrade because it is the way to address change through really complicated supply chains. And that's certainly why we're...
And that's one of the big differences between Fairtrade and something like Rainforest Alliance, because with Rainforest Alliance, the entire structure is designed to support the fire. So it's instead of it being about income diversification, it's about increasing yields. It's about, you are a cocoa farmer, you need to make us more cocoa. So that's if you're worried about the certifications, go with Fairtrade rather than Rainforest Alliance, because that's where the impact is the best. And yes, you're right. The end goal of Fairtrade is for us not to exist. The Fairtrade 2 words, we have 10 principles of Fairtrade, and they exist because for most of the globe, we are not protected as workers. So workers don't have the protections of being able to join a union and protection against discrimination and all of these kinds of things that are enmeshed in those 10 principles of Fairtrade. They exist because the governments have failed to implement them. So actually, where Fairtrade comes in is at the point where the individual country governments are making those legislation, and it's empowering. The whole point is that people feel like they have control, they have the opportunity. the first principle is creating opportunities for marginalised people. So it's creating opportunities. It's not about you're a cocoa farmer, you're always going to be a cocoa farmer. You just need to make us more and more, might pay you a bit more. It's very, very different. The Ghanaian government is quite keen on increasing processing, and as is the Ivorian government, because that's 70% of our cocoa comes from those two countries. So both of those governments are keen. I actually went to the first commercial export level chocolate factory in Ghana, which is set in a cocoa growing community at a place called Sahum, which is just north of Accra. It's called Fair Afrique. It's a German company, so we are slightly colonial with this. So the German company has built this factory and brought in that they employ about 100 people in various levels of processing, right the way through the supply chain. And it's run with solar panels, which why isn't everything run in Africa with solar panels? It makes no sense. And you can see from where the chocolate is being made, you can see the cocoa. Now, the interesting thing about that is they can't do everything on site, but they can send it to a place called Tema, which is just outside Accra, and you can produce the cocoa butter and the cocoa powder, and then that can come back so there's lots of different things that are happening on a very small scale. Around about 5% of and decreasing of all of the cocoa that's grown in Ghana is actually turned into either cocoa nibs, which are, so if you buy a kilo of cocoa beans, that costs about £2.50. Buy a kilo of cocoa nibs, that costs about £25. So that's the sort of income generation that you're talking about. If you allow the cocoa farmers to do that, those two extra processes to get it so it's cocoa nibs, there's a lot more value in that. And essentially, it's about what they want to do. So if they want to be setting up small-scale chocolatier type for the local market, that's great. We can support them with that. If they want to be building a factory, then there's lots of different ways they can go and work at Fair Afrique, learn the skills. So yeah, essentially, there's lots of very exciting things happening at a small scale in Ghana that we're only just learning about now, and really all of the power is with the farmers.
Coming on to the second part, the other part of the question. I mean, I think in the longer term, the shifting markets has quite significant implications. I mean, firstly, remember that Fairtrade is an international network. As I said earlier, with producer networks in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So I think what Mike was talking about earlier was the sort of colonial dynamics of trade, that producers in low-income countries were producing for mainly North America and Europe, which were the high consumer. But that's shifting. So the growing consumer markets, the future growth in consumer markets, is in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And now there are a lot of challenges in that growth, but certainly there was this idea that they're not going to be interested in standards. And lots of research we've done here and elsewhere shows that there is a growing interest, and particularly I think the networks, the producer networks who are based in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, really understand those markets and the dynamics of them. You can buy fair trade products in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, probably much more limited than here, but you can definitely buy them. And as they continue to really building on, I think, what Joanna just said, that provides avenues for selling fair trade products within those markets, and therefore the future growth. And that sort of comes back to the earlier point of getting a balance between kind of fair and local, but you're getting much more of, I think, an underlying shift in the dynamic. But from my perspective, what's so important about Fairtrade is it's the only organisation that is genuinely international, that includes producer voices and producer networks that can feed into the process, rather than it just being a top-down decided. I mean, people like, not naming too many companies, but big global companies like Unilever, they know that, and they're off in all those markets. So it's bringing the producer groups and the producer voices in. So I think there's for me, it's a big shift. It'll take time. building this, one of the issues with chocolate, for example, why it's so addictive, and I am a complete addict, should put my hands up here, is because it melts at body temperature. But if you're in Africa, there's a major issue because the external temperature is higher. So therefore, what you're going to be getting is a sort of liquid. So you also have to have a cool chain to allow to keep, and that's evolving as development takes place. And those solar panels can also charge up the cool chain, the fridges in which you keep the chocolate. So very rapidly you can buy now chocolate in parts of Africa. Previously you couldn't physically, for obvious physical reasons. So I think there's an enormous amount of potential, but it will take time. But for me, the key is bringing producer voices into that process and not just decided by the multinationals.
Sorry, I'll start off. I'm sure other guys will have a comment. Don't underplay the power of consumers. Look at our voting system. Look at our political system. When there's such short-termism amongst the political class, we're not going to get long-term change from short-termism within the political system. Unless politicians think that voters and consumers, because we're the same, right, are interested. So us showing the power of our beliefs and our wishes sends a really powerful message to the political class, because we're always saying, you wouldn't need fair trade if there was enough regulation done in the right way, which really was properly thought through. So it wasn't just yet another top-down thing to impose on farmers in the global south. If it was done properly, you wouldn't need a voluntary scheme because it would be taken care of. We're not there yet. So looking at the political system we've got, we need consumer power more than ever before, because the short-termism is terrible. We're not going to solve the climate crisis with the political system we've got unless there is long-term political momentum by consumers and voters. Right? So that's the first thing. Second thing, in terms of the agency and the freedom that we've been talking about, just as one small example, but it's an interesting one. Kenyan tea farmers, Kenyan tea smallholders, who have been involved in fair trade for a chunk of time, used some of the extra money they were getting through fair trade to diversify, because they could see that long term the tea market globally was declining. The black tea market is declining. It's a trend. They could see that they weren't going to be able to get what they needed for their own businesses and their own aspirations just out of selling, even if it was on fair trade terms. So they used some of their extra money they were getting through fair trade to buy property. So they built an office block, and they bought some more land. So whether you think property is the right thing or the wrong thing for them, that's them deciding on their futures. And that is a community-owned asset now, which is completely independent from the colonial or post-colonial tea trade. So it's about giving people the opportunity, like Joanna was saying, to sort of be the agents of their own future. But yeah, just to go back to my initial point, consumer power and voter power is more important than ever, really necessary, I think, in the current political climate.
Just to build on that, because I think if we use the word citizen, maybe it would feel a little bit less. Because I don't like being seen as consumer. I make a lot of choices to try and lessen my consumption, to be more conscientious in what I consume. And I think Mike's point around marketing and being really skeptical of the marketing we get is really, really important. But I really like the fact that I'm one of many billions of people in this world in what can feel like a really difficult, challenging, you can feel really disenfranchised by global politics or the economy. Like, how can you make a difference, right? You make a difference because you choose that product over another one. It means that you actually have a voice and a say in that agency as a consumer, and that you can get involved in a movement in a really, really easy and simple way. And personally, I find that really inspiring, because actually, we started off by saying, what's the achievement spin of the fair trade movement? Well, the achievements are, we're 30 years in to this part of the fair trade movement, and there's 2 million farmers that have adapted. How exciting is that? What if in 30 years' time we're at 40 million farmers? I think that's really, really exciting. So I'd reject the word consumer if that doesn't work for you. It personally doesn't for me. But if you can think that this is a way you could be a better citizen, and actually you have that hard-earned money that you've made, and you care about where that goes, you care about the food that it comes from, you care about your health, you care about the people in the supply chain, you can choose where you spend that money. And I think what we've touched on today is really about the power that curiosity, that empowerment of knowing that you have that choice can have. So I just really encourage you to get curious about all of this.
Yeah. And just to add to that, yes, it's really important that we as consumers choose fair trade. When I was growing up, Kodak was a massive company, and now it doesn't exist. And the reason is that they just didn't respond to customer demand. We can close down enormous companies if we choose to by just not buying from them. That's the only reason that companies exist, is because we buy from them. And further to your point, we are not doing what you suggest in terms of you as the public see public-facing campaigns from people like Fairtrade Foundation. What you don't see is all of the behind-the-scenes stuff. So you don't see the policy work. You don't see the conversations that are going on with the big organisations and the small organisations and people, all of the individual small licensees of the fair trade mark that are being encouraged to buy more fair trade and do more things. So what you can do as individual citizens is make good choices and choose fair trade where that's an option for you. But that is a very small part of what fair trade as a movement is doing. And actually, one of the things that is most important for you to do is just to explain to people why you're choosing fair trade, because doing it quietly only goes so far. And as we mentioned before, if you go into a shop and you're disappointed not to find a fair trade product, tell them. If you go in and you're delighted to find a fair trade product, tell them as well. Because that's important. It's important that the co-op knows how wonderful it is. It's important that retailers know that you value the choices that they are making as well. Even if you don't buy it, if you see it and you like the fact that that's there and you weren't expecting it to be, tell them, because they'll love you for it.
I actually have a fair trade campaigner in Tower Hamlets that emails me on a monthly basis giving me feedback, which I actually really enjoy. So do you reach out and do you engage?
Fantastic. Thank you very much to the audience for your beautiful questions and our panelists. I can appreciate we've gone a little bit over. We do have one last closing remark, questions for our panelists here. With 30 years being celebrated today, perhaps in 20 years for our 50-year anniversary, 70th anniversary, where do you see the future of fair trade? This is for everyone. Yeah. It's for everyone. It's a little quick remark.
I'd like it either not to be necessary, not to exist, or to be completely owned and run by the farmers and driven from the global south. And then we will be privileged to buy their products from them if they choose to sell them to us.
I would second that. I think that it's more integrated into the main trading system and that the trade system adapts precisely in the way that's might.
Howard Msukwa, who is a rice farmer from Malawi, he said the future belongs to the organised, and that basically if we all work together in partnership as small and large organisations, then we can do this.
I'm going to quote coffee farmer Sylvia Herrera, who spoke at the Fairtrade 30th event this summer, who said, there are so many more important things in the supply chain than money. And I really would hope that in 30, 70 years' time, we have a completely different concept of wealth, of prosperity, that it's not just seen as a monetary figure, that we truly value, our world and the people within it, and it's much more equal and redistributive.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. Please join us around the field and for the